Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to one of the last weeks in Kiddushin. We are going to have a siyum. I think it's Friday of next week, November 3rd, to celebrate the end of the siyum. So we're almost there. And we are, I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is my Jewish Learning's Daf Yomi Week in Review. Lovely to see you all. And to help us steer around some ideas in the last week's Dapim, we are joined by Rabbi Abigail Halpern this morning. Go ahead, Rabbi Halpern.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be learning Torah with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Sorry. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, as I try to find the button, I'm going to tell you about what we're learning about today, which is we're going to look a little bit at a sugya, a piece of Talmud about nida, about Jewish laws about menstruation. And then we're going to look at some medieval and modern commentaries on what is the point of these laws for modern feminist people? Is there any value in them? And I think those are questions that are brought up by this sugya that those learning Daf Yomi would have seen last Friday. And if you're not learning Daf Yomi, you will see right now. Why can't I find the screen share button? Oh, it's right here. Okay. Great. Thank you for being patient. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Perfect. Okay. So we're looking at this little piece. We're in a kind of emotionally difficult section about forbidden kinds of relationships. And I just want to flag that when we see things about different kinds of forbidden sexual relationships, that can bring up a lot for people. We're not going to dive so deeply this morning, but I just want to note that. So the main question that we're going to see in this little bit is, in what cases does kiddushin, the rabbinic form of betrothal, work? And in what cases does it just not work? Like, you can do all of the actions and it just doesn't stick. It kind of slides right off the two parties. Okay. So Rabbi Yonah says, and some say this was taught by Rav Huna, son of Rav Yehoshua, we have this rabbinic chain of transmission, and we're not always clear exactly which ideas came from who. The verse states explicitly in the chapter dealing with forbidden relatives, i.e., you can't marry your sister, etc. Whoever shall do any of these abominations shall be cut off. And again, that's talking about forbidden kinds of sexual relationships. In this verse, all those with whom relations are forbidden are juxtaposed to one another, i.e., everyone where there's a forbidden sexual relationship has all the same rules. And therefore also to a wife's sister, which is one of the categories of people that your sister-in-law is what would be one of the people that in rabbinic Judaism and in the Torah are off limits. Just as betrothal is not effective in the case of a wife's sister, so too betrothal is not effective with regard to all those with whom relations are forbidden. So we have this prior knowledge that if you walk up to your sister-in-law and you say, we're engaged now, and you give her a ring, it just doesn't work. You've done nothing. And the same is true for any other person who it's forbidden to have a sexual relationship with. Okay, here comes a big question though. Wait a minute. The Gemara asks, if so, then even if a man betroths a menstruating woman as well, his betrothal should not be effective. Because having sex with someone who has their period is one of the kinds of relationships that's forbidden in this long list in the same chapter in Leviticus that all these other prohibitions are. And so it should be that, you get up under the chuppah, and if one partner has their period, it just doesn't work. Okay, that feels kind of ridiculous though. Not least because someone who's your sister-in-law is always your sister-in-law, but someone who has their period doesn't always have their period. So if so, why did Abaye say, all concede with regard to one who engages in intercourse with a menstruating woman or with sota, who's a woman who's forbidden to her husband on suspicion of having done adultery, that the offspring is not a mamzer, i.e. in this category of offspring of forbidden relationships. Chizkiah said, in the case of a menstruating woman, the verse states, and her impurity be upon him. And the language that's used in the verses in Leviticus about someone who has her period and the kind of impurity that can spread is utihi. It's from the word vehaya, like lihiyot, to be. So even at the time of her impurity, the type of becoming, i.e. the word havaya, the same shoresh, the same root, stated with regard to betrothal, because that's the language the Torah uses for kiddushin, that lihiyot, havaya, that same Hebrew word is used about marriage, should apply to her. And so this is basically a pun. That how do we know? You might think that kiddushin doesn't work for anyone who's in a category of someone who it's forbidden to have sex with. Someone on their period is in that category. So you might think that kiddushin doesn't work. No, that's wrong, says the Gemara, because, and this is a kind of wild pun, because we have the same word in a context of talking about sort of nida, menstrual impurity, spreading and being, I want to say contagious, but contagious has a lot of moral valence that I don't mean to have here, and that's the same word as the Torah elsewhere uses for marriage. So we know that nida doesn't undo betrothal, which I think is a really wild use of the language here, in that it's about the like way that impurity, because it's kind of spreads like cooties in the rabbinic framework, that like if I touch a frog and then I get impurity from touching a frog and then I touch you, you can catch that from me. Same is true for all kinds of other states of impurity, including all kinds of bodily goo.
Rabbi Halpern, can I pause you for a minute and ask you to share the link to the source sheet in the chat for folks who want to
of
and be able to
course.
navigate it?
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, I see you chatted me and I missed it. Thank you. Yes, I'm sending the chat right now.
It's hard to focus on everything.
So many things. All right, thank you. Okay, there we go. And so we are in the first section here. And so what this sugya made me think about is, it seems like when the rabbis are trying to understand what makes nida, what makes the state of menstrual impurity different from all kinds of other things that in the rabbinic framework are a problem to have sex, to be in like a sexual context with, there's something about nida that seems to be uniquely different, in that it seems like it's actually in some ways about connection rather than not connection. That this like haya, this root of like to be, the way that it's about both like used for the way that impurity is kind of fluid and spreads, can also be, it's the same root as for marriage. And I think there's something very interesting and under the surface here about what is nida. Okay. Some of you might be super familiar with what nida is, and some of you might have never heard of it before. And we're going to get on the same page. Okay. So basically, all of the biblical sources for this prohibition are in Leviticus, and we're about to see some of the main verses. And essentially, there is the short on 1 foot version, is that this is still practiced by a lot of traditional Jews, is that when a person is menstruating, they don't have sex until they immerse in a mikveh, a ritual bath. And we're going to look at a couple different ways of understanding what this is about. And I think depending on how we understand it, it can be more or less meaningful, palatable, not wildly sexist, yes, wildly sexist, very upsetting and stigmatizing about bodies, totally like a beautiful way of connecting with God. And I am not here to push any particular view, but I just want to give you some tools to think about it. So, which we've sort of alluded to already, is if you look at the verses, there are two main categories that we could put this prohibition of sex while on your period in. And one of those is the forbidden relationships category, in the same place which is kind of the same bucket as adultery, as incest. Some people would add homosexuality to that list, though I would not. And that goes in and so we can understand it in the bucket of this is about kinds of sex that you shouldn't be having, and that's the main category for it. And we have two verses that I've brought you from Vayikra. You might know this. Some synagogues read this at Yom Kippur Mincha as the Torah reading. So do not come near a woman during her menstrual period of impurity to uncover her nakedness. And uncover her nakedness, legalot ervata, is one of the phrases the Torah uses to talk about sexual relationships that the Torah wants to flag as bad. And then we have this even more escalated version 2 chapters later in Vayikra 20. If a man lies with a woman during her menstrual condition would be a great punk band name, and uncovers her nakedness, he has laid bare her flow and she has exposed her blood flow. Both of them shall be cut off from among their people. There's something about a couple having sex when one of them is menstruating that is separating this couple from the Jewish people in some way. Yeah, Leah or Leah, forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce your name. There is also a connection with blood as the essence of life. Yes, hold that thought. Yes, we're getting there. Amazing. Okay. So one way to understand what's going on here is that this is about a kind of separation and boundariedness. So I've brought us a little excerpt from an essay by Jay Michelson, who is a queer Jewish scholar. And he's making a claim about what all of these sexual prohibitions that we see in Leviticus are about. He says, this text is about ancient cultic purity and the prohibition of foreign actions and mixtures that contaminated it. After all, what do menstruation, vultures, leprosy, and male-male anal sex have in common? Ethics? Hardly. Right? This is not a moral thing, he says. Yet, if Leviticus 18 is about order and chaos, indeed, if Judaism sets itself up against a real or imagined other that sacralizes the liminal, then liberated sexuality and an a fortiori transgressive sexuality may be transgressive of the basic ordering norms of biblical Judaism itself, which extend beyond the holiness code to dietary laws that divide water creatures from air creatures, from earth creatures, and that abhor any transgression of these boundaries. In smaller words, what that is Jay Michelson is saying that having rules about sexuality, having very strongly boundaried senses of sexuality, is part of the same project by which you would say, don't mix milk and meat, which is biblical Judaism, and I would add rabbinic Judaism, he's saying, are a project of creating boundaries, creating order in a chaotic world. And it's all about preventing kind of fluidity between boundaries and instead kept creating really separate senses of period, no period. Leprosy, not leprosy. And that's in the sense where this is reading Nida as primarily about sexual prohibitions. That, right, a prohibition on sex when someone's menstruating is in the same category to be understood as a prohibition on adultery. There's this boundary crossingness to it. Okay, maybe not though. Okay. But there is another set of verses about Nida that is not in what gets called the Holiness Code, which Jay Michelson just referenced, which is the list of forbidden relationships, but is talking totally about purity and impurity. And in ancient Judaism, especially in the times of the temple, purity and impurity were really important categories for engaging with the temple. You could only engage with the temple, you could only eat sacred food if you were in a state of purity. And things that could make you impure include assorted bodily discharges. So that's like periods, ejaculation, all kinds of like other assorted genital discharge, but also touching a mouse or coming in contact with a dead body. Things that we might say loosely fall into the bucket of things that are kind of yucky. There are a million scholars screaming at me right now that that's not what purity and impurity is about, but for our purposes, we're going to go with it. But that's just know that it's hotly debated what purity and impurity are about. But we have these verses where earlier in Leviticus, where Nida is actually about purity and impurity and is not about forbidden sex. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge being blood from her body, she shall remain in her menstrual separation 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be impure until evening. Anything that she lies on during her menstrual separation shall be impure, and anything she sits on shall be impure. And then it goes on. And one of the things that these verses go on to say is that anyone a person has sex with when they're on their period also kind of gets that period impurity. They get that tumat nida. But it doesn't seem like there's a prohibition on doing that. There's no prohibition on becoming impure, right? There's no law that says you can't have your period because that makes you impure. That would obviously be incoherent. And so it seems like there's another way of understanding nida that's sort of in the bucket, not of sexual prohibitions, but of purity and impurity rules. And then their sex is kind of just like an offshoot of that. And Rabbi Dr. Rachel Adler, who's one of the foremost Jewish feminist theologians in all of Jewish history, has written 2 important essays about nida. I've brought you some from the first essay from 1973. In her first essay, Rachel Adler talks about nida in this kind of redemptive way about how actually nida is more about tuma and tara, purity and impurity, and we're about to dive into what she says that's about. And it's not about stigma around menstruation. It's not about it's not about making women or other people who menstruate kind of in a taboo state. And then in the essay from 1993 that I did not bring you for the sake of time, she recants all of that. And she says, no, I've been too apologetic. This is irredeemably sexist. But we're going to look at her earlier essay for now. So whereas tumat nida, menstrual impurity, had been a way for women to experience death and rebirth through the cycle of their own bodies. So she says, nida is actually about women being attuned, or anyone who menstruates, being attuned to a cycle of death and rebirth. That we're all constant, she says in the rest of the essay, tuma and tara, purity and impurity, is all about engaging with death and life in a cyclical way, and being attuned to when we're closer to death states and when we're closer to life states. And nida is a framework that gives people who menstruate access to being tuned into that. And it's about being tuned into one's own body. However, it became distorted, she says, into a method of controlling the fearsome power of sexual desire, of disciplining a mistrusted physical drive. She says it gets twisted into being a sex stigma. And so there's this sense in which purity and impurity can be a way of understanding nida that is not about primarily, is this a sex problem, but it's about this sense of being tuned into death and life. And there's obviously so many problems with saying that menstruation is about life and death, not least because everyone in their lives has encounters with death, life, possibility, loss of possibility, in ways that are or are not connected to what's happening in our own bodies. And in her later 1993 essay, Rachel Adler also says, well, that's all well and good. You can have whatever nice framework you want to understand nida, but that doesn't change the fact that in social reality, communities where this is practiced, the effect of it is to stigmatize people who menstruate. I'm not taking a side on between Adler 1973 and Adler 1993. I think both of those. I think she's right in both in different ways. Okay. I want to suggest a third way of understanding what nida can be that is beyond Is it about a sex prohibition or is it about impurity? And in particular, I think this is interesting because our very own sugya that we saw at the beginning in Kiddushin seems to think that there's something about Nida that has to do with connection. Okay. So this is a comment by the Bechor Shor on parts of Genesis. The Bechor Shor was a medieval French commentator. And he's commenting here on the command that God gives Abraham to circumcise himself. Okay. So we're talking about circumcision now. We've jumped. We're in Genesis, we're talking about circumcision. Okay. And since the Holy Blessed One commanded men and not women, we learn that the place of manhood, phrases Makom Zachrut, was where the Holy Blessed One commanded to seal the covenant. And the blood of Nida that women guard and tell their openings to their husbands, this is to them the blood of the covenant, dam brit. And dam brit is generally used as the phrase that refers to the bleeding at circumcision. And what's happening is the Bechor Shor is saying, okay, if we think that circumcision is so important, how can it be that only some Jewish people have access to this dam brit, this covenantal blood? So, and the Bechor Shor says, no, actually, menstruation is another form of covenantal blood. And with the important caveat that the world is not divided into people who can be circumcised and people who menstruate. I think this is a really interesting attempt to get at the ways that different bodies can have different experiences of the world that can be understood and framed as ways to connect us with each other and with God. That there's this attempt to say, okay, we're not actually going to say this kind of covenant is only for people who can be circumcised. Actually, we're going to look and see what are the other places where there might be similar but not the same experiences. Okay. I want to close with this amazing, amazing piece by Rabbi Dr. Bana Dvara Haberman, Zichronah Livracha. She has this amazing essay that I cannot recommend strongly enough about the Yom Kippur Avodah, the temple service on Yom Kippur, as representing women's bodies. And I've brought this tiny, tiny piece that's about the blood that's being brought as part of the sacrificial processes of the temple on Yom Kippur. So in this context, the blood stands for life. It is in lieu of life itself. The blood runs down to the earth from the corners of the altar. It functions in the tabernacle as menstrual blood does in a woman's body. Sit with that image for a minute. The blood of the sacrifices in the temple is like menstruation. We can see the enactments of the avoda as replicating the menstrual cycle of purification. So the Bechor Shor, who we just saw, says that practices around menstruation, that having Jewish frameworks for menstruation, is covenantal in that it is like Brit Milah, it's like circumcision. And Bana Haberman is saying that the sacrificial processes of the temple are like menstruation, and that there is a sense in which those ways of connecting with God, which we might think of as sort of ancient and no longer happening, have these resonances with experiences that we might be having in our bodies. And I think that these texts, which are specifically about Nida, they're specifically about menstruation, they're specifically about giving Jewish legal framing for what to do with our bodies when different things are happening with our bodies. They're very specific, but they're also very, very general. That these are all about an attempt to look at our bodily experiences and the world around us and say, how do I make meaning from what's happening in my body and have that be something that connects me with God, that connects me with other people, and that I give significance to the experiences of my body and I don't treat them as incidental or a barrier to connection, but that actually we're not just souls, we're bodies, we're not just minds, that actually what we do with our bodies and how we engage with the world through our bodies is something that can be connective and spiritual. Okay, I gave myself a little extra time, so I've finished 5 minutes early, but I would love some reactions in the chat. See an endorsement of the red tent by Anita Diamond, strongly second versus sign, Siman, yes. Claudette, please.
Um, I'm a bit confused.
Amazing. Tell me
Um,
more.
yeah, I'm confused about what this Nita has to do with betrothed. Because in my head, when I'm doing this stuff, I see betrothal as a form of engagement, which means that they're saying that betrothal, the man can take the woman right away and have sex with her.
Yes. So typically, that's a great question. So yeah, the conclusion of the sugya is that betrothal works when a person has their period. But a person who has their period can't have sex. So there's,
Right.
yes, exactly. That's a really good paradox. Yes.
But so
Good
they're
noticing.
saying that when a man comes to a woman and betroth her, there's no other process. He can go to bed with her right away.
So he has to wait. He has to wait. The betrothal works, but they have to wait. That's kind of how the rabbis get around this. That the betrothal works. They are engaged, they are betrothed. However, they cannot have sex right away. And there's pages and pages and pages. You're asking this question, and there's days and days worth of class we could do on this, of what happens if a couple has a wedding when one of them is menstruating because they can't have sex yet. There's an opinion that actually they have to sleep separately until the menstruating partner goes to the mikveh, for example. Yeah. So there's a real attempt to deal with that. But it does mean that it's a kind of less straightforward betrothal wedding process.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. All right.
Any other questions or comments? Rabbi Halpern, maybe there's something behind this a little simpler, which is that I'm wondering what you think, that menstrual impurity is like very temporary, right? Like,
Yeah.
like your sister remains your sister forever, but menstruation is that's a state that all women cycle in and out of, and we know they're all going to go into it, or most. We know that the majority are going to go into it, and we know that it's temporary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's absolutely undergirding all of this, is that, right, if we talk about other kind, that in some ways that's where the purity model is much more true when talking about Nida than the sexual prohibition model, right? Because purity and impurity are states that all people move in and out of, even though Nida is the one that's sort of most live in a lot of Jewish communities today, right? Whereas the rest of it is about states and identities.
Leah, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah,
Like to ask a question?
yeah, I was just reflecting on boundaries again. Here in Olam Hazeh, we need boundaries to define us. The boundaries, as we progress through these Kabbalistic four worlds, gradually disappear until we reach Atzilut. But there is still an inviolable boundary between the world of Hashem and our temporal world. And when they're talking about boundaries here with Nida, I think that might reflect it. My question is that a is that a factor in the setting of these boundaries? Is that reflected in any way?
Ooh, that's a really deep question for when we have 1 minute left. Thank you for bringing that. I think you'll have to forgive this being a not really an answer. Your question deserves a better answer. But I think that the question of what kind of spiritual and sort of deep cosmic meaning the rabbis are creating when they talk about all kinds of halacha, right? All kinds of Jewish law. It's all about boundaries and distinctions. That what are the spiritual goals there is a huge, huge question that I think so much has to do with what is our own lived experience of these practices and how are they playing out in our own lives.
Yeah. I think they were wrestling with a lot of times with how to relate to these enigmatic creatures called women.
For sure, there's a sense in which there are people who have different bodily experiences talking about other kinds of bodies, and that's very live here.
Hmm.
Rabbi Halpern, can we take one more?
Absolutely, we can take one more.
Mary, like to ask your question? I saw your hand go up and go down.
Okay, at this time. This discussion has made sense of another rabbinic passage for me. It's where the rabbis say there's 3 punishments for women because of Eve's sin. And they're the separating of challah, nidah, and lighting the Shabbat candles. And it's always been, I've always thought this was sort of an invitation from the rabbis for women to disagree, because it is hard to imagine lighting Shabbat candles and seeing it as a punishment. You're bringing light into the world. You're bringing light into the eyes of your family around you. And the same with the separation of challah. Making challah is taking ingredients from the first 6 days of creation and turning it into something delicious for family and friends. But nidah was always a mystery to me. And now I see nidah is bringing life into the world. This menstrual cycle represents that. So it's been really, really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, that passage is really complicated that you're referencing of these are the women's practices in response to sin and how do we think about that? And that can be really difficult. And I really appreciate your framing.
We will have a lot more opportunity to think about nidah as we approach the end of the Daf Yomi cycle. When we finish Kiddushin next week, we're going to be finishing the 3rd section of 6 in the Talmud, the one that deals with women called Nashim, but nidah is actually filed under purity and impurity questions in the Talmud. So we are going to have a lot more opportunity to think this through, but like everything in the Talmud, right, there's discussions, all these things interweave and intermesh, and it's interesting to see them show up in other contexts. So we are going to leave it there. I'm going to just mention before we go that we will have a siyum to celebrate. Sorry, I'm typing and speaking, always a mistake. I have put in the chat the sign up for the siyum, which will be on Friday, November 3rd at noon Eastern time. So add or subtract hours for wherever you live. That was our best attempt to have it not interfere with Shabbat for the majority of our participants. So it will be noon Friday Eastern. There's a sign up there. We'll also start sharing that in the daily email next week. And it was a pleasure to learn with you all. And thank you, Rabbi Halpern. And thank you to all of you for your great questions. And we will see you next week. Yes, Emily, it will be recorded. We always record these. We always put them up on our YouTube channel, which, by the way, is My Jewish Learning Com. Great tag there. My Jewish Learning Com is our YouTube channel. You can check it out. Other recorded classes also go up there. And then I don't know if you've noticed, but in the daily emails for the next day or two, we usually share a link to it at the very bottom. If you scroll past everything, you can find the recording of that week's class. But you can also go straight to our YouTube channel for it. Either one. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And we will see you soon. Bye-bye.